Walter, at the end of the French and Indian War, the empire, it seems to me, was very prudent in that it did two things which, in hindsight, look perfectly normal. The first is that it began to try to raise some revenue from what it had decided were fairly wealthy American colonies. And it drew a line to limit their westward expansion, to try to prevent an Indian War, which would have been an added expense on top of the expenses of what we know as the French and Indian War. All seems very wise in hindsight, but wound up agitating the colonists no end and producing what we know as the American Revolution. Now, the circumstances that brought on the American Revolution were very different in New England than they were in the southern colonies. And can you reflect for us a little bit on what was happening in South Carolina, which we don't hear as much about as we do in Boston? I mean, the Revolution didn't begin and end in Boston.
No kidding. I'm sorry, was that too light?
No, not at all.
Well, when you talk about the end of the French and Indian War, or as the mother country called it, the Great War for Empire, yeah, they were trying to do two things. And it's interesting, there were two major treaties at the end of that war. One was the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war. The other was the Treaty of Augusta, which was signed by the governors of Virginia, the two Carolinas, and Georgia, with the chieftains of the Cherokee, the Catawba, the Creek, and the Choctaw to settle peace in the Southeast. You don't hear much about what happened during the French and Indian War in the Southeast, but the whole frontier from Georgia to Virginia was literally ablaze when the Cherokee decided to declare war. So there's a reason why they wanted to have that Proclamation line, which is what the English called it. And they actually set up two bureaus of Indian Affairs, you remember, one for the North and one for the South. The one for the South was based in Charleston. But the Carolinians, particularly the South Carolinians, didn't care about the Proclamation line. The Cherokee still occupied the southwestern portion of the state. But it made a great deal to the gentlemen in Virginia and to a lesser extent in North Carolina, because they'd already begun to settle, or at least claim lands beyond the mountains.
Well, that's certainly true. The Virginians were looking, in 1763, the Virginians were already looking into the Ohio Valley to lands beyond the Ohio River, and much of the land, the valuable land along the Ohio River in what is now West Virginia and easternmost Kentucky. They already had their eyes on that land. Whereas in South Carolina, settlement hadn't extended beyond what we now know as sort of the middle of the state. Is that right?
Well, it actually had gotten up into the Piedmont, except for that southwestern quadrant. And most of the settlement in South Carolina was different than it was from Virginia or even North Carolina. And that is, instead of coming through Charleston and moving westward, they had come down, the settlers from Pennsylvania and Virginia had come down the Great Wagon Road through the Shenandoah Valley into the Piedmont of the Carolinas. And that was very recent settlement. Some just before the French and Indian War, but a great deal of that came afterwards. And so there was plenty of open land in South Carolina, and they weren't pushing up against the Cherokee, because the main Cherokee settlements were in South Carolina and right over the mountains in Tennessee.
Well, that's a very different situation than you have in Virginia, where the Virginians are already pressing up against the Blue Ridge, and the Proclamation line is really just beyond the line of Piedmont settlement in Virginia, and you already have the Ohio Company and the Indiana Company already established to exploit land beyond the Ohio River, which is land beyond the Proclamation line. So you don't have that at all in South Carolina. I wonder, you have all these settlers who've come down into South Carolina from Pennsylvania and Virginia, Maryland. Those people don't have the kinds of political connections, family ties to people in the Tidewater. And so is there a cultural distinction?
Absolutely. The Low Country elite was a very special place, and as you know, that was the wealthiest portion of the British Empire in North America. And these folks in the back country, for the most part, are Scots-Irish with a few Germans and English sprinkled in. So they're ethnically different, they're religiously different, they're most of them Presbyterians, a few Baptists, but mostly Presbyterians, and you've got a very elite society, very wealthy society in the low country, both planter and merchant class, that's really tied to the Atlantic world. And they don't care about what goes on in what they call the back country, even though by the time of the Revolution, 2/3 of the white population lives in the back country.
So we're talking about up the Santee, up the Congaree River,
Yeah.
and the area where, say, centered around what is now Columbia.
Actually, no, it's beyond that.
Even beyond that.
Actually, the area around Columbia wasn't settled until after the Revolution. It was in the middle of the state. They came in. Those folks came in through the back door, and some folks had begun to go a little bit up the rivers as far as Orangeburg, for example,
right.
But they hadn't yet gotten to the Congaree yet. So that they're literally separated by a no man's land. There's nobody there.